Chapter 1. Lucy concentrated on smiling at the lord she was dancing with. What was his name? She racked her brain. She'd danced with him before, but he was the most unmemorable person she'd ever met in her life, and she'd never been good at names anyway. His hair was brown. His eyes were the exact same shade of brown as his hair. She usually liked brown eyes, but his were the exact color of dirt. Who wanted to look at dirt-colored eyes? Lucy was thrown off for a moment. She'd never seen anyone who matched themselves quite so well. Why, even his suit was the same color brown as his hair and eyes. Did he do it on purpose to emphasize his boringness? Did you have a nice time at the ball last night, Lady Lucy? I enjoyed our dance together. Lord whatever his name was smiled at her. His teeth had a piece of some kind of green caught between them. Was it just last night they danced? Why couldn't she remember his name then? It was very nice, she answered blandly. Nice summed up the last 15 balls she'd been to. They weren't nearly as much fun now that Charlotte was married, and they couldn't talk about who was lying every evening. She wondered if she should tell the man about the food in his teeth, but she really didn't know him well enough to tell him anything. I thought so as well. Say, would you mind if I called at your house for a walk in the park tomorrow? Lucy gaped at him for a moment. Their house was close to Hyde Park, and many gentlemen had stopped by at one time or another to walk with her or her sister. She had no idea how to get out of walking with him. She didn't want to. She really only danced with him because he was the only man who had asked. The song ended, and she took a step back, hoping to find a way of avoiding his question. Lucy wasn't exactly a diamond of the first water. Or even a quartz of the third water. She wasn't asked to dance a lot, and she was fully aware of why. She talked too much. When she was actually interested in a man anyway. She would start a nervous chatter that wouldn't stop until the dance was over and the man looked as if he wanted to run from her. Just as she wondered if she could slip away to the ladies' retiring room to get away from him, a young man stepped between them. He bowed over her hand and kissed it. May I have the next dance? Lucy stared at him, nodding. He had dark hair and piercing soft blue eyes. We haven't been introduced. Asterisk. Prince Daniel of Giselvakia was bored out of his mind. He'd been in England for 2 weeks, and had done nothing except attend ball after ball. Was this all that people did in this silly country? At home, he'd have spent all day helping his brother, the crown prince, and his father with the laws of the country. He'd studied to be a solicitor so he could be a good advisor. His eyes scanned the crowd, looking for someone, anyone, who could alleviate his boredom. It took only a minute for him to spot her. She was in the middle of the dance floor, looking just as bored as he felt. That she was in the arms of another man mattered little to him. He would wait until the dance was over and sweep the beautiful young maiden into his arms and dance the night away. He laughed softly to himself. She was probably married with 3 children at home. Why was he even bothering to make the round of parties in London when he had yet to meet a woman worth knowing? The dance ended, and he made his way across the crowded ballroom. Finally, he stopped in front of her and smiled. May I have the next dance? At first, the beautiful girl nodded, but then she said, We haven't been introduced. He sighed. The English were so formal about things. In his country, he could introduce himself to any lady he saw. It wasn't ever a problem. Well, let me rectify that for you, he said, bowing low over her hand and pressing a kiss to the back of it. I'm Prince Daniel of Giselvakia, and you are the most beautiful woman I've ever seen. Lucy felt as if there was something in her throat preventing her from speaking. Lady Lucy Stenwick, she murmured, blushing profusely. Her mother would have a fit if she found out that Lucy had just introduced herself to a young, eligible prince, but she saw no way around it. Where is Giselvakia? She'd never heard of the country, but that didn't mean a lot. She'd never been one to apply herself to her studies of geography. He took her into his arms as the orchestra began playing a waltz, guiding her carefully through the throng of partygoers. Giselvakia is in Eastern Europe. In the Ural Mountains. It's nice to meet you, Prince Daniel. Lucy had found her voice again, and she struggled to keep from chattering at him. She wondered if he'd run away like all the others if she talked to him about how blue the walls were. Were the walls blue? She turned to check. And you, Lady Lucy. Tell me, are you married? Because I believe I'm half in love with you already. It was a statement he'd used many times to woo a lady, and he was certain it would work on this little English miss. Lucy saw a mist of green pass over his face. She'd been born with an odd ability to see if a person had good intentions. He had very bad intentions right then. She didn't know what he was thinking, but she certainly wasn't going to agree to a walk on the grounds with him. I'm not married, she said with a smile, hating that this man wasn't going to be her Prince Charming. She desperately wanted to find the man she was destined to spend her life with so she could be done with the marriage mart. Parties every night for months out of the year were tiring. No, she wanted to retire to the country and raise babies as her siblings were both doing. Daniel's smile widened. Not married? A woman as beautiful as you? Lucy shrugged. I guess I just haven't found the right man. What was he up to? The green had faded, but she'd never forget that she'd seen it there. Tell me about your country. That would keep things formal. He couldn't keep complimenting her if he was talking about Giselvakia. Was that what he'd said the name of his country was? Giselvakia is a small country. It's about as large as London with fewer people. My family has been the ruling family for the last 1,000 years. He sighed. Ladies always wanted to hear about his country. None of them were interested in him as a man. I'm the second son, so I'm not in line to inherit. My older brother, Christian, will be the king. We have 3 younger sisters and a younger brother. Oh, my. That's a big family. Is it cold there? He nodded. It's a mountainous country, and we're known for our cold climate. We're also known for our sapphires. The sapphires in our country are a pale blue, and our ruling family has eyes that match them. You do have an unusual shade of eyes. He nodded. In my country, I would be known immediately by the color of my eyes even if I wasn't known by my face. He sighed. It's hard to be discreet about anything when you are known wherever you go. Lucy made a face. I'd hate that. How can you sneak out and get into trouble if everyone recognizes you instantly? The dance ended then, and she gave a slight curtsy. It was nice meeting you, Prince Daniel. She turned to go back to her mother, who was her chaperone for the evening. She had far less freedom now that Charlotte was married. He caught her arm. But you haven't given me your address, so I may call on you tomorrow. You're not getting away that easily, Lady Lucy. Lucy studied him for a moment, biting her bottom lip in indecision. On one hand, she truly wanted to get to know him better, but on the other hand, she didn't trust him. She knew his intentions weren't pure. I don't think that's a good idea. Thank you for the dance. She turned and strode across the ballroom toward her mother. Prince Daniel watched her go with a slight smile on his face. She was the most beautiful woman he'd ever met. He wasn't letting her go. He looked around for his host. Being of the royal class had its privileges. Asterisk. Lucy sat in the parlor with her mother the following afternoon, staring out the window instead of working on the needlework on her lap. Usually the day after a large party, she wanted to talk about everyone she'd seen and danced with. Every man who had even smiled at her. Today? She could only think of the pale blue eyes that had met hers as she danced. Who was the man you danced with after Lord Bentley? Lord Bentley. That was the abysmally boring man's name. She turned back to her mother. That was Prince Daniel. He's visiting from Giselvakia. I think it was Giselvakia. The country had a long name. She shrugged. She'd never been keen on geography, and she was certain she'd never see the man again. Her mother blinked at her for a moment. You danced with a prince last night, and you can't remember the name of his country? What is wrong with you? Lucy shrugged. I just don't feel like his intentions were pure. Her mother didn't know of her powers. The lineage had come through her, and Lucy's grandmother had explained where the powers came from, but her mother? Her mother wasn't even aware that her daughters could have powers. What does that even mean? Her mother asked. A man's intentions are never pure. I'm sorry, Mama. I probably won't ever see him again. He didn't mention any plans to stay in the country for an extended period of time. Of course, he hadn't said he was planning to leave soon either, but she didn't feel like her mother needed that information. There was a knock on the door then, and their butler brought a single card on a tray. Prince Daniel of Giselvakia is here to see Lady Lucy. Shall I show him in? Lucy was startled. How had he found her? He couldn't have been in the country long enough to make a lot of connections, and he'd just met her last night. Horatia jumped to her feet. Yes, please show him in. Lucy sighed. She was a mess. She was wearing a boring house dress that was several years old, and her hair was pulled back into a bun, instead of being fashioned well. She didn't know why she wanted to look her best for him, but she did. Prince Daniel strode into the room as if he owned it, walking straight to Lucy and bowing low. It's so good to see you again, my lady. His slight accent sounded sweet to her ears. Lucy smiled. And you too, Prince Daniel. I hope you don't mind, but I asked Lord Barrington for your address last night so that I could call on you today. It was all Lucy could do to keep from telling him that she minded. How dare he? She'd told him she didn't want him to call on her. Of course not, she answered, knowing her mother would have the vapors if she said anything different. Would you care to go for a walk with me? He asked. I would love to accompany you to Hyde Park. His eyes were filled with amusement. He'd known she didn't want to go with him, and he was keeping her from having a choice. Lucy took one look at her mother's excited face and knew what her answer was. I'd like that. Let me get my shawl and my maid. Charlotte had just married the month before, and Lucy still wasn't used to being the only daughter at home. Prince Daniel gave her a quick nod. I will wait with your mother. He turned to Horatia and smiled. You have raised a very charming daughter. I hope you will allow me to get to know her better. Lady Stenwick nodded with a smile. I would like that a great deal. Who introduced you to Lucy? He paused for a moment and debated on what to tell her. Finally, he decided the truth was in order. I saw her beauty from across the room, and I'm afraid I didn't wait for an introduction. I walked over and begged her to dance with me, but she wouldn't because we hadn't been introduced. So I introduced myself. I hope you don't mind terribly much. Her eyes grew wide. Well, it's not the way things are supposed to be done, but I can't complain too much. You are a prince after all, and I'm certain you're used to getting your own way more than most. He inclined his head briefly to indicate she was correct. I was getting ready to move on, because I was certain I'd met all the young ladies in London, but I was wrong. I met Lucy, and I knew I had to stay longer. How long do you think you'll be able to stay? Are you the crown prince? He shook his head. No, ma'am. I'm the second son of King Hector. My older brother, Christian, will be the king. Father is in the process of passing on the crown now. He's getting older, and he wants to spend his last years in peace. I see. So how long do you think you'll stay? He smiled. It depends on our fair Lucy. I'll stay as long as it takes to make her my bride if she suits me. If not, I'll move on. My father told me not to come back to Giselvakia without a bride. So you are serious about finding a wife right now? Lady Stenwick got more and more excited with every word that passed his lips. It was obvious to him that she was ready to hand over her daughter at a moment's notice. Chapter 2. Lucy pushed open the door to the parlor and saw her mother hanging on Prince Daniel's every word. He was obviously her mother's dream for her hand, and she knew she'd have to do some fast talking to get out of marrying the man at this point. Unless he just didn't like her. Of course, she liked him too much to try to push him away. But what about his bad intentions? I'm ready, she said softly. Prince Daniel looked up with a smile. I'll have her home in an hour or two, he said to her mother without glancing her way again. He only had eyes for Lucy. He walked into the hall and offered Lucy his arm, nodding curtly to her maid. Will she follow us the whole time? He asked. He knew it was the custom in this silly country where everyone had to be proper every minute of the day. Lucy nodded. Yes, Abigail is always the one who accompanies my sister and I on our strolls. Sister? He opened the door for her and walked with her toward the park, which was quite close to the Stenwicks' town home. My sister, Charlotte. She married last month. And she'd married a duke. Lucy loved her sister, and she was happy for her, but a duke? Now her mother thought a prince was within Lucy's grasp. Charlotte shouldn't have set that precedent. And is she happy? Lucy smiled and nodded. Oh yes. She and Anthony seem to have a wonderful marriage. Almost as good as Diana and Percy's. And who are Diana and Percy? I forget that you know nothing about me. Percy is my brother, who is now the Earl of Stenwick. He married Diana almost a year ago. She's going to have a child in about 2 months. Lucy had done a great deal of reading about childbirth since she'd found out Diana was carrying. She desperately wanted to know the gender of their baby, and there were so many books that said you could tell by how a woman carried. So you will be an aunt? He asked. Yes, and I can't wait. I have a nephew. Charlotte's new husband, Anthony, was married before, and he had a son. She skipped a little as she talked about it, forgetting that she was supposed to walk with small ladle-like steps. Do you have any nieces or nephews yet? He shook his head. No, my older brother will be married soon. Our younger siblings are much younger. My oldest sister is only 12, and my father believes girls should be at least 18 to marry. Lucy nodded. I can agree with that. I wasn't ready to marry before that at all. Prince Daniel patted her arm. You're ready to marry now? If the right man comes along, I believe I am. She was believing more and more he was the right man. She just wished she could get Charlotte into town to find out if the man was a liar. She wondered if there was any way they could have a family gathering either at the house where she'd grown up or at Anthony and Charlotte's home. She'd write to both Diana and Charlotte later and see what her sisters had to say. How will you know if you found the right man? He asked. Lucy frowned. Well, it will depend whether or not his intentions are pure. How will you know that? He stopped walking and led her to a bench just outside the woods. She sat on the bench and turned to him. I would count on my family to help me know that. If I had growing feelings for a gentleman, I'd want him to go with me to Stenwick Manor so I could get to know him better, but also so my family could get to know him better. My sisters are excellent judges of character. Prince Daniel raised an eyebrow. You trust your sisters that much? She nodded. I do. Then let's go to this Stenwick Manor. I believe I'm falling in love with you, Lady Lucy. He'd never felt as drawn to a woman as he did to the girl beside him. He didn't know if the feelings were true, but he was more than happy to explore them and see if he could get her family's approval. He needed to know that he was going to be accepted by them. You can't love me. You don't even know me. He smiled. I know more than you think. I know you were dancing with a man who you had no feelings for last night. I would venture to guess you don't even remember his name. Lucy frowned. Sure I do. What was it then? He gave her his half grin that told her he knew she was bluffing. He was Lord Bingley. Lord Bingley? You're certain of that? Lucy nodded, not at all certain, but he couldn't possibly know the dullest man in London when he'd been there such a short time himself. Could he? I don't think that's the right name. I was introduced to him last week as Lord Bentley. Lucy sighed. I'm not very good with names of people or countries. Why, I've already forgotten where you're from again. So I was right that you were dancing with a man whose name you didn't even know? Yes. You were right. Why, she hated to admit it, she didn't know. I've also noticed that you don't like to admit to not knowing the things that you should know. She shrugged. Who does? His eyes danced with laughter. Who indeed? He traced her cheek with his finger. I've noticed that you adore your sisters and miss them a great deal. Lucy smiled. Everyone knows that. My sister Charlotte is my best friend, and Diana is a close second. I've noticed that you don't care for balls and would rather be with people you care about than dancing. That's very true. I think the same is true for half of the women in London for the season, though. So will you arrange a few days where I can meet your family? I want to get to know them. I need their approval for you to marry me. He looked over at Abigail, who was watching them from a bench nearby. Tell me, is your maid easily bribed? Lucy sighed. Abigail had been bribed by Anthony more times than Lucy could count. Probably more than she knew about. I'm afraid she is. He laughed and walked over to Abigail, slipping a coin from his pocket into the maid's hand. When he'd finished, he walked to Lucy and took her hand, pulling her to her feet and into the woods. They went just far enough that they weren't visible to everyone in the park, but she could still call out to be heard by Abigail if she needed to. He stopped and turned to face her. I just want to kiss you once. I'll know if my feelings are real if I have that chance. Would you mind? Lucy bit her lip, considering. She wanted to know if she felt something for him as well, but kissing in the park. She'd never been kissed, and she wasn't certain this was the time or the place. Finally she nodded. He cupped her face in his hands and slowly lowered his head until their lips met gently. He simply moved his lips against hers, not moving to deepen the kiss, because there was no need. Just the simple act of touching his lips to hers had his body on fire. He had never felt so much passion for a woman in his life, and they'd done nothing together. She was perfect for him. There was no doubt. Lucy clung to his shoulders, feeling decadent. She knew couples frequently hid in the woods in Hyde Park to kiss, but all of her sojourns had been platonic. A walk through the park ending with a promise to see one another again. Not that there had been many of those. Lucy had never been one to attract a lot of attention from the opposite sex. All at once she knew why the matrons didn't want young girls kissing men. They might feel what she was feeling and be willing to do it on a more regular basis. She tingled from her lips all the way down to her toes. When he lifted his head, Daniel rubbed her bottom lip with his thumb. I want to take you home to my family as my bride, he said, surprising even himself. Until just that moment his intentions had simply been to kiss her and enjoy himself with her. Now? He couldn't imagine his life without her. A simple kiss had changed his entire world. Lucy stared at him in shock. There was no green mist over his face. He was telling her the truth. He wanted to marry her. Still, she needed her sister's opinions. I'll write to Diana and Charlotte when I get home. Diana shouldn't travel in the condition she's in, but I don't think she'd mind if we came to visit. You'll arrange it? Lucy nodded slowly. I will. Everything was moving so fast. Yesterday, she'd been a bored debutante at yet another ball. Today? Today, a prince wanted to marry her and take her home to his family. How could so much change in so little time? He stroked her cheek and brushed his lips against hers once more. If your family agrees, can we marry immediately? Lucy blinked. How fast is immediately? She didn't want to disappoint her mother the way Charlotte had with her 3-day engagement. She knew her mama thought that a wedding wasn't real if the banns wasn't posted, and that took 3 weeks. As quick as your laws allow. In his country, there was no waiting period for marriage, and he found the laws of England strange, but said nothing about them. Finally she nodded. If my brother agrees and both sisters approve, then yes. We can marry immediately. She'd never imagined she could feel for a man what she felt for Daniel. How had he befuddled her so quickly and completely? After he deposited her back at her family's townhome, she went to her room and quickly wrote the letters she needed to write. She knew Diana would be happy to host them, but she needed a specific date and time to arrive. And they'd need the vicar, of course. If only to distract her mama. Asterisk. The letter from Diana came within 24 hours. She'd sent hers by special messenger and instructed he wait for a reply, so she really wasn't surprised to get an answer so quickly. My dearest sister Lucy. You know that you are more than welcome at our home any time. I'm thrilled that you've met a young man you are interested in spending your life with, and Percy and I would love to get to know him. I've sent Charlotte and Anthony an invitation for a family weekend starting Friday afternoon and ending Sunday evening. That should be enough time for all of us to know if he's the man you should spend your life with. I can't wait to see you both. Much love. Diana. Lucy read the letter once more and smiled to herself. She wasn't worried about how to get word to Prince Daniel, because he had come to see her that afternoon promising he would be back the next. Since she'd first laid eyes on him, she'd not gone for 24 hours without seeing him. When he arrived just after luncheon as she'd expected, she told him what Diana had said. His face split into a wide grin, and his eyes danced. Sounds good. Let's tell your mama what we have planned. Lucy bit her lip, worrying it. Don't tell her you want to marry quickly. She thinks people will talk if there's a fast marriage. Daniel nodded. I promise I won't. We'll tell her when we know for certain we want to marry. They went into the parlor where Horatia was sitting doing some needlework. It was how she occupied most afternoons, believing it to be the way a lady should spend her time. When they got into the parlor, Lucy looked at Daniel, hoping he'd take the lead in talking to her mother. He caught her eye and nodded briefly, letting her know he understood. Lady Stenwick, I was wondering if I may have a moment of your time. Horatia looked up at him, her face full of excitement. She obviously thought he was about to ask her for Lucy's hand in marriage. Yes? I'm very interested in marrying Lucy, but she won't accept my proposal unless she has the whole family's blessing on our union. She sent a letter to your daughter-in-law, who has invited us for the weekend. I'd like to accompany you to the country if I may. Horatia looked like she was about to jump to her feet and clap, but instead she remained seated calmly. I think that's a very good idea. What time would you like to leave? Daniel looked at Lucy. How long will it take to get there? It's a 3-hour drive from London. He made a face. He preferred to make long journeys on horseback, not with 2 women in a coach. Why don't we leave just after luncheon then? That will give us time to get settled before dinner. Horatia nodded. That sounds perfectly reasonable to me. Daniel and Lucy went back into the hall. I want to walk with you. I'm not ready to leave yet. We'll have a lot of time to be alone at Stenwick Manor, she reminded him. She needed a few minutes to herself to think about how quickly everything was moving. He poked his head back into the parlor. May I take Lucy for a walk? And Abigail, of course? Horatia nodded. Dress warmly. 10 minutes later, they were on their way. Why can't you ever take no for an answer? You seem to love going to Mama and getting her to agree to what you want whenever I refuse. He grinned down at her. I'm a prince. I like to get my way. As they walked, with Abigail following 20 paces behind them, Daniel whispered, I'm going to bribe her again. I have to kiss you. Lucy blushed. You have to? There's no way you can control yourself and wait until we're at Stenwick Manor when it will be easy to sneak away and kiss whenever we feel like it. He looked down at her. That sounds like heaven to me. She laughed. I never thought I'd meet a man who thought my kisses were one of life's necessities. His face split into a grin. Well, I never thought I'd find a woman I had to sneak around with to get those kisses. Really, things are much more lax at home. Your country would let you just kiss a girl in front of everyone? He shrugged. I never felt the need to, but I'm certain no one would say anything. It isn't a problem to go for a walk without a chaperone either. You English are too uptight about things. His accent sounded stronger than ever as he spoke. If we marry, will we spend all of our time in Giselvakia? She asked, suddenly realizing she would be missing her family. Where is Giselvakia? He asked. Isn't that where you live? Lucy was more than a little frustrated by the confusing country name. Why couldn't he be a prince from France? That was easy. Of course, if he was a prince from France his head would have been chopped off, so it was probably best that he was from the country with the confusing name. I'm from Giselvakia. I've never even heard of a country called Giselvakia. She sighed. Until a few days ago, I'd never heard of Giselvakia, so you need to pardon my forgetfulness. They'd reached the benches where Abigail would sit outside the woods. Daniel dug into his pocket and handed the maid a coin. Same as before. Abigail nodded and happily sat on the bench with her back to the woods. Lucy shook her head at the maid. Mother would be so angry. Abigail just grinned. She'll never know. Daniel grabbed Lucy's hand and pulled her into the woods again. As soon as they were concealed, he wrapped his arms around her and she raised her lips to his. They'd only kissed once, but she'd enjoyed it. This kiss was much more urgent than the first had been. His arms wrapped tightly around her, and his hands roamed over her back. His tongue sought entrance into her tightly closed mouth. Open for me, sweetheart. Lucy obeyed and was immediately surprised when his tongue entered her mouth to mate with hers. She was startled but liked it at the same time, feeling confused. How could his lips touch hers, and suddenly her stomach felt as if butterflies were about to beat each other to get out of it. She certainly hoped her siblings approved of him, because she wasn't certain she could hold out if they didn't. Chapter 3. Lucy's mother slept the entire journey from London to Stenwick Manor, leaving Lucy and Daniel to talk quietly together. Her mother had insisted on sitting beside her in an effort to make sure nothing happened between them, but she'd fallen asleep immediately. By the time they'd reached her childhood home, Lucy knew all about his brothers and sisters. His 3 younger sisters were silly in his mind, and it was obvious. His younger brother was 5 years younger. That's a big gap in age between you and your brother, Lucy commented. He nodded. My mother died in childbirth. I was 4 before father remarried, and Lucinda had my brother, Benjamin, and my 3 little sisters. I'm so sorry you lost your mother. Even if you don't remember her, I can't imagine what it would be like to grow up with no mother. He shrugged. Lucinda has been around for as long as I can remember. She did her best. He wasn't particularly fond of his stepmother, though, and it was obvious by his tone of voice. Lucy leaned forward and grasped his hand. Her movement caused her mother to grunt softly in her sleep. I wish life had been easier for you. He chuckled. Easy? I'm a prince. I didn't have to do anything I didn't want to do. His voice was casual, but she could see an underlying sadness on his face. You don't have to go back, you know. We can build a life here. Daniel shook his head. I have to go back. Father groomed Christian and me to run the country together. I'll be my brother's advisor, and at least for now, Father will watch over us both to ensure we do what's right for the people of Giselvakia. Lucy smiled. She liked the idea that he cared about nothing more than the people of his country. His color remained true, so she knew his intentions were pure. She knew as his wife she could make it easier for him. When they pulled up to Stenwick Manor, she felt the familiar pang she did every time she saw her family's ancestral home. She hated seeing the old house and knowing that she would never again live there. There were so many memories tied to the place that she knew she would never have a home she could love nearly as much. Daniel jumped down first and held his hand up to help her down. You grew up here? She nodded. I know it's not a palace like you grew up in, but it's home. He smiled. I did grow up in a palace, but nothing like Buckingham Palace. The Prince Regent had a small dinner party for me when I first arrived 3 weeks ago. That place is monstrous in comparison to the palace I grew up in. He thought it was sad that a king had felt the need to have a palace of that size. So much good could have been done for the people of England with the money wasted there. She smiled. I'm sure if I ever see it, I will faint at its size. I've never exactly been invited to Buckingham Palace. Well, it was large and overwhelming. You'll find my palace is smaller, but a lot homier. I think you'll be happy there. He held her hand as they walked toward the front door. Do we just go in? Yes, they're expecting us. She opened the door and bellowed out, Diana, Percy, we're here. She knew it wasn't ladylike, and she should be more circumspect, but he needed to know what he was getting if they were to take the relationship further. She hoped she wouldn't embarrass him back in Giselvakia, but she wasn't about to change just because she might marry a prince. Percy's butler walked in, shaking his head. You're never going to learn any manners, are you, Lady Lucy? Lucy laughed and threw herself at the older man, hugging him tightly. Not if it means I have to stop doing this. Bertram just shook his head. Someday, you're going to meet a man who's going to make you want to grow up. Lucy blushed. Bertram, I want you to meet Prince Daniel. He's from Giselvakia. Daniel sighed and shook his head. Giselvakia. He nodded to the butler, wondering at Lucy's familiarity with him. Bertram looked back and forth between the two. It's nice to meet you, Prince Daniel. He gave his attention to Lucy. You can't be thinking of marrying a prince. You'll make his family faint with your lack of manners. Although the man's words were scolding, it was obvious to anyone who listened that he was teasing Lucy. Lucy blushed furiously. I have good manners when I'm not at my family's country home where I feel comfortable. Mostly. Daniel laughed at the exchange. This is the first time I've seen her act like anything other than a perfect lady, he told Bertram with a grin. Bertram raised an eyebrow at Lucy. Now you know you need to act like yourself. You don't want him to have a big shock after the wedding, do you? Lucy threaded her arm through Daniel's, pulling him away. Is Percy in his office? Bertram nodded. No, he's in the back garden. He's playing with some stones. Lucy sighed, looking at Daniel. My father left our family impoverished, so Percy has become a stonemason to support us. I see nothing wrong with a hard day's work. Do you? Daniel was stunned for a moment before shaking his head. Not at all. Sometimes it's the difficult, unexpected circumstances that show you who a man really is. Percy's the best. She pulled him down the long hallway toward the back of the house. You'll like him a lot. She threw the back door open and rushed through it, throwing herself in the arms of yet another man. Daniel had never seen a woman who was so open with her affections. "Percy, this is Prince Daniel of Giselvakia." Daniel shook his head. "Giselvakia." He looked at Lucy with a frown. "Do you forget deliberately?" Lucy made a face. How would one go about forgetting something deliberately? "I'm just not good with strange-sounding names." Daniel sighed, holding his hand out to Percy. "I'm Prince Daniel of Giselvakia, and I'm hoping to leave here with your approval to marry your sister Lucy." His words were formal, but the half-grin on his face made it clear that he was smitten with the young lady beside him. Percy wiped his hands on a towel that was hanging from his pants before shaking Daniel's hand. "It's nice to meet you, Prince Daniel. Where exactly is Giselvakia?" Lucy looked at Daniel with a frown. "Are you sure you didn't tell me it was Giselvakia?" She felt as if he changed the name of his country every time she blinked. Daniel ignored Lucy's question and responded to her brother. "Giselvakia is in Eastern Europe along the Ural Mountains." Percy nodded, obviously taking the other man's measure. "And you're a prince? Are there a lot of princes in Giselvakia?" "There are only 3. My brother, Christian, is the eldest, and will be the king. We have a brother who is 5 years younger than me as well. His name is Benjamin." "I see. Would you be taking my sister back to Giselvakia?" "We wouldn't want to never see her again." Daniel smiled, happy to answer the other man's questions. He was glad that Lucy was so well loved by her family. "I would do my very best to split the years. We could spend winter here, and summers at home." He shrugged. "Providing nothing happens to Christian, of course, but he's always been in good health." "Of course." Percy seemed to consider everything the man was saying. "We'll spend the weekend getting to know each other. I'm certain I'll have an answer for you soon." Lucy stepped in then. "I haven't made a decision about him one way or the other. I want Diana and Charlotte's impressions of him." Percy smiled. "You'll get them quickly, I'm sure. I want their opinions as well. I need to know if he's good enough to marry my sister." Lucy blushed. "He's a prince, Percy." She couldn't believe her brother would act like a prince may not be good enough for her, a mere earl's daughter. Princes can be louts, just like everyone else. Percy looked back at his work, a bench he was making. "How do you feel about me working to support my family?" he asked Daniel. Daniel sighed. "In my country, all the people work. It's not like here where there's a class of idle rich. Why, even I've been trained to be a solicitor if anything were to happen to my family. It also helps me make the right decisions as my brother's counselor. We were trained to make all state decisions together." Percy smiled. "I like that attitude." He looked over at Lucy. "Why don't you go find Diana in her parlor and let her know you and Prince Daniel have arrived? She's excited to meet him." As soon as Lucy disappeared into the house, Percy looked at Daniel. "Why are you interested in Lucy?" Daniel was surprised at the other man's bluntness. He was used to people begging him to marry their family, not this suspicious attitude. "She's special. As soon as I saw her dancing with a man whose name she couldn't later recall, I knew she was the one for me. Her sense of humor and easy laugh are things I need with my too serious family." Percy nodded slowly. "I want my sister and wife to get to know you. They have impeccable judgment when it comes to men." Daniel raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Not many men would feel so strongly about their wife's opinion of the man their sister was courting. Lucy burst through the door a moment later, dragging a heavily pregnant woman by the hand. She was a beautiful young woman with blonde hair. Daniel smiled. "You must be Lady Diana." Diana nodded, her eyes studying Daniel's face carefully. "Welcome, Prince Daniel." She curtsied briefly, not able to do the gesture justice in her advanced state. "I've heard good things about you," Daniel said simply. There was something mesmerizing about the girl. He couldn't quite put his finger on what, but she was fascinating. Lucy walked over and stood beside Daniel as Diana had instructed in the hall. She wasn't certain why her sister-in-law felt so strongly about seeing them together, but she wasn't going to argue with her. She took Daniel's arm and smiled up at him. His eyes danced down at her. Diana's face lit up at the sight of them together, and she nodded at Percy. They look good together, don't they? Percy raised an eyebrow. You tell me. Perfect. They look absolutely perfect together. Lucy had a feeling her sister's words meant more to her brother than they did to her. Daniel thought the conversation was strange, but he said nothing. Would you like to show me around the grounds, Lucy? He asked. Oh, I'd enjoy that. Lucy looked at Percy. Do you mind? Percy shook his head, looking at Diana. Do they need a maid to chaperone them? They'll be fine. Give them some time to get to know each other without a maid trailing after them. Diana waved them off with a smile. Have fun. Lucy was surprised by the response, but she wasn't stupid. She half pulled Daniel away from her brother and sister-in-law and took the path toward the lake. We lived here all except for our time in London during the season when I was a little girl, but when Father died, we moved to London. We've lived there almost exclusively since. Mother was embarrassed of Percy working for a living, so she wasn't willing to be here while he did it. Daniel shook his head. I don't understand not being able to appreciate hard work. A man should be proud of the work he does. I agree with you. It's just not the way things are here. Lucy wished things were different though. Percy's work was wonderful, and she wanted to shout from the rooftops about her talented brother. When they reached the lake, she sat on a bench looking out over the water. My brother made this bench, and Diana's father bought it for her before they ever even met. Daniel studied the stonework. It's amazing. He does good work. Lucy smiled. He does. He made that fountain too. She pointed toward the fountain at the edge of the water. Daniel walked over to the fountain and felt as if he heard a familiar voice in his head. Make a wish. He laughed and shook his head, running his hand along the stone. Beautifully done. Compelling. Lucy nodded. When I was out here a couple of weeks ago, I felt like it was speaking to me. He turned to her in surprise. You did? What did it say? She shrugged, looking down at her feet embarrassed. I felt like it just told me to make a wish, he told her, watching her carefully. She looked up and nodded, excitement covering her face. Yes, exactly. That's what it did with me as well. It told me to make a wish. Did you? Lucy tilted her head to the side for a moment, studying him. She couldn't help but wonder what he'd say if she told him she'd wished for true love. I did. Did your wish come true? He asked, his voice teasing. I think it just might have. He raised an eyebrow and turned back to the fountain, hearing the words again. Make a wish. He shrugged. What could it possibly hurt? He thought his wish rather than speaking it aloud. I wish that everyone would approve of me as a potential husband for Lady Lucy, and that she and I will be married before the weekend is over. Your wish has been granted. When he heard the words in his head, he laughed aloud. It said my wish has been granted. He looked at Lucy. Where did Percy find this thing? Lucy stood and walked over to him, putting her hand on the fountain beside Daniel's. I told you. He made it. She waited to hear the voice tell her to wish, but it was no longer there. Strange. Maybe the fountain was a one-wish wonder. How could he make it so special? I don't know the right word, but I think this fountain can really grant wishes. I'm not sure. I think Diana may have had something to do with it. She seems almost magical to me. She did to me as well. I wonder what it is about her. He looked over her shoulder and saw a couple approaching. We have company. He wanted to be angry, but he couldn't allow himself. He should have kissed her quicker. If they were given the opportunity again, he'd be sure to take it. Chapter 4. Lucy turned and saw Charlotte and Anthony walking toward them. She rushed forward to hug her sister. They'd seen much too little of each other since Charlotte's wedding. You didn't bring William? Charlotte laughed. No, I missed you, Charlotte. No, good to see you, Charlotte. You only love me for my son. Lucy rolled her eyes. I loved you before you had a son and you know it. She looked at Anthony. Did you bring William? Anthony draped his arm around Charlotte's shoulders. He's upstairs with his nurse. Oh good. I want Daniel to meet him. Lucy felt Daniel's hand on her shoulder and took the opportunity to introduce her sister and brother-in-law. Anthony, Charlotte, this is Prince Daniel of Giselvakia. Giselvakia. Will you ever remember the name of my country? Daniel sounded amused rather than perturbed. Lucy shrugged. It's a long name. He shook his head and held out his hand for Anthony. It's good to meet you, Anthony. Anthony grinned, inclining his head. And you, Prince Daniel. Oh, please call me Daniel. It's an informal weekend. Charlotte held her hand out. It's nice to meet you. I'm Charlotte. Hello, Charlotte. Lucy thinks a lot of you. Charlotte looked at her sister, her eyes full of laughter. She has good taste in sisters. After winking at Lucy, she said, Mother sent me out because it's time for luncheon. She said the two of you had lollygagged alone for long enough, and as long as she was the chaperone, it wasn't going to continue. Lucy sighed. I knew it was too good to last. Percy actually gave us permission to walk out alone with no maid. Really? Charlotte asked in surprise. Did Diana see you together? Lucy frowned. Percy sent me to get Diana as soon as we got here, and Diana told me in the hall I had to stand beside Daniel as soon as we got outside. Why? She whispered. Charlotte smiled. Ask her. I think she'll tell you as long as you admit to knowing whether or not people's intentions are good by looking at them. Lucy's eyes widened. Does she have a power? Like us? It's not for me to discuss. Talk to her. Charlotte linked her arm with her sister's as they walked back toward the house, leaving the men to follow. I will. Lucy's mind was racing. The women in her family were said to have received their powers from ancestors back before the Norman conquest. Could there be another branch to the family who received them as well? Were they possibly related to Diana from many centuries before? I'm glad we were invited this weekend, Charlotte said. I've missed you. Lucy smiled at her sister. I've missed you as well. Ton parties just aren't the same without you by my side. Charlotte smiled. I sure hope you can stop going soon. They become so dull after a while. When I was a little girl, I dreamed of the days when I would get to twirl around a ballroom with a duke or an earl all evening long. The reality is much less glamorous and more sweaty. Lucy laughed. Very true. I didn't mind the party so much as long as you were there too, and we could play our little games. Now, it's just boring. Mama stands off to the side and watches, but she's lost interest too. Lucy leaned her head closer to Charlotte's. I think she's smitten by the vicar here. Charlotte looked at Lucy and laughed. The vicar? Oh, wouldn't that be wonderful? If Mama got to find love again? Lucy frowned. Do you think she loved Father? I really don't know. I doubt it. The match was made for them. She was never really given a choice. They'd reached the house at that point. Lucy walked up to Percy. Where's Diana? Percy looked at her. Are you going to be interrupting my work all weekend? Only if you're rude enough to work during the party. Where's Diana? He laughed. I forget just how truthful you can be sometimes, Lou. Lucy grinned. With Charlotte for a sister, I've learned that even little white lies just aren't worth it. She poked him in the arm. Where's your wife? She's in her parlor. I think she's trying to knit some booties for the baby again. Lucy shook her head. Her sister-in-law not only hated knitting, all she did was make knots. Why did she even try? Thanks. She hurried into the house, and found Diana where Percy had said she'd be, knitting needles in hand, and a knotted mess on her lap. Why do you even try? Diana frowned. Because I'm about to be a mother, and mothers are supposed to knit small, pretty things for their babies. Lucy walked into the room and sat down beside Diana. Why? Because every other mother you know has done that? I don't think you need to knit to be a mother. You're going to be a good mother, simply because you have so much love to give. Diana smiled. Thank you. She patted Lucy's arm. I like your prince. I think he's going to be a very good husband to you. Is that why you had us stand together? Because you could only tell if we'd be good together that way? Tell me, do you see colors? Or is there a cloud over someone? How is it for you? Diana frowned. Has Charlotte been talking out of turn? Lucy shook her head. No, I guessed, and Charlotte refused to confirm or deny. She won't lie at all, you know. She told me to come talk to you and tell you about my power. Diana looked at Lucy. Your power? It's not a good one like Charlotte's, but it tells me when someone's intentions are pure. Like when you knit, I know that your intentions aren't to impress people, but you really want to make something special for your baby. Charlotte always asked me before going on a walk with a gentleman at a ball, because I knew if he intended to get to know her better while they walked, or if he wanted to drag her off into the bushes to kiss her. Diana grinned. Sounds like a good power to me. Mine is different. I think of mine as the power of love. You see, when I look at a couple together, I can tell if they're meant for each other or not. Most people are pretty neutral when they stand beside one another, but some, you can just tell, they should never even have a conversation, let alone marry. And Daniel and I will be good together? Yes, the best. There are very few couples who could be as happy as you and Daniel. Charlotte and Anthony were destined for one another. I knew the first time I saw her walk past him at a ball. Your brother and I belong together as well. Lucy's smile widened. That's why you were always doing odd things at balls, isn't it? You're able to do more than just tell, though, aren't you? Diana nodded slowly. I can make a man think of nothing and no one but me while he's in my presence. I have to concentrate to make it happen. It isn't automatic, like the ability to see if a couple belongs together. So when you saw a couple that didn't belong together, you'd concentrate and keep them apart. In a way. You see, I can tell if a couple is really wrong for each other, or just not a good idea. I only interfered if a couple would not be able to tolerate one another. Like with your sister and that man she almost married. I don't even remember his name. Lucy laughed. Neither do I. She hated you for years. Diana sighed and looked down at the knotted mess on her lap. I know. She understands now, though. Did you make the fountain Percy made give people wishes? Diana giggled. Yes, I've always known I was supposed to do it. It only talks to people it can help, and it's only ever one wish per person. What if two people who are not meant to be together wish for each other on it? Diana shrugged. It hasn't happened yet, so I don't really know what would happen then. Well, I wished on it a few weeks ago, and it said my wish would be granted. I think it's giving me Daniel. Probably. You two really were meant to be together. Percy knows, and he won't interfere. I know he doesn't like the idea of me moving off to Giselvakia. Lucy shook her head. It's so far from home. I can't imagine living in a palace either. Daniel says the palace he grew up in is much smaller than Buckingham Palace, but I know I won't belong there. How will they feel about me running around barefoot through the palace? Diana smiled. We'll come visit you as often as we can. Besides, he's not the crown prince according to Percy. You should be able to come home to visit as well. Percy said something about half the year here, and half the year there. I could do that. Lucy sighed. I love him, Diana. I know. You wouldn't even consider leaving otherwise. You aren't a girl who wants to be a princess. Charlotte always dreamed of a prince riding up and carrying her away with him. Not me. Diana grinned. Yes, and then Charlotte almost refused a duke. I never thought of it that way. Lucy giggled. Silly Charlotte. His lies bothered her. I guess he's stopped lying to everyone now. He has no reason to, Lucy told her. He's happy now. She stared down at the knotted mess on Diana's lap. Do you want me to make some booties for the baby for you? I don't think it's something you should even try to do. Diana sighed. I don't need them. My mother has already knit 15 pair. I just wanted him to have something that was just from me. Lucy patted Diana's hand. Well, you're the only one who can give birth to him and nurse him. That should be enough, right? It should. Standing, Diana moved across the small parlor and picked up a book. I think I'll read a novel instead of worrying about my failure at knitting. Dinner will be early. We don't have an orchestra, so there won't be any dancing, but we'll make sure you and Daniel have plenty of time together. Trying to marry me off? You two are meant for each other. Now that you've met, there's no need to try. It will happen. Diana left Lucy sitting there staring after her. Lucy could only wish she had her sister-in-law's confidence. Chapter 5. Lucy was sitting in her room reading an hour later when her mother joined her. Yes, Mama, she asked politely, already knowing why her mother was there. What were you thinking going off alone with him? Percy said he didn't mind, and we weren't gone for long. It was just a short walk to the lake. Charlotte found us within a few minutes of us leaving the house. Lucy knew her mother was worried that her marriage would be forced as Charlotte's had been. Not that either Charlotte or Anthony had minded. Don't go off with him alone again. I want you to have a maid with you at all times. Lucy sighed. Nothing is going to happen. When you care for someone, like you obviously do for Prince Daniel, something could happen. We need to be vigilant to make certain it doesn't. Promise me you won't go off without a maid alone again. I promise I won't go off without a maid alone again unless Percy says that I may. He is the head of the family after all. Lady Stenwick threw her hands into the air. You make me crazed sometimes, Lucy. Lucy simply smiled and watched as her mother slammed from the room. Asterisk. After dinner, Lucy and Daniel again went for a walk through the grounds, but this time Charlotte and Anthony trailed along behind them at their mother's insistence. When they reached the lake, Daniel sat beside her on the bench. You wanted your sisters to meet me. That's why we came here. Are they satisfied that I'll be a good husband to you? Lucy nodded slowly. Yes, they both are. She took his hand in hers. Thank you for humoring me. It means a lot that you were willing to come out to the country for a weekend to meet them. Daniel looked over his shoulder and saw that Charlotte and Anthony had stopped in the gazebo and had their backs to them. Your sister is a worse chaperone than your maid if that's possible. Lucy giggled, moving closer to Daniel. I think she wants you to kiss me. He looked into her eyes. I wouldn't mind that one bit. He cupped her cheek as he lowered his lips to hers, kissing her softly. How would you feel about getting married tomorrow? Lucy gasped. Tomorrow? We can't possibly get a license that quickly. I procured a special license before we left London. We can't marry today, but we can certainly marry tomorrow. She tilted her head to one side and thought about it for a moment. I love the idea, but Mama would be scandalized. Half the country will be scandalized. I don't mind. Do you? She laughed. Not particularly. What about your family, though? Will they mind if we have a small wedding? I was told not to return to my country without a bride. They can't complain if I follow orders. Lucy nodded, her face lighting up. Yes, let's marry tomorrow. I don't care what anyone says. Daniel pulled a ring from his pocket. I've been carrying this around since the night I met you, just waiting for the right time. It belonged to my mother. Lucy couldn't see it well by the light of the moon, but the sparkle was pretty. I like having something that belonged to your mother. He cupped her face in his hands, gently kissing her lips. I like you having it. He gently bit her lower lip, causing her to moan softly. I don't want to wait until tomorrow to marry you. Lucy wrapped her arms around his shoulders and moved closer to him. I don't either, but we have to. Mother's going to want to kill us as it is. She doesn't like short engagements. She thinks it makes us look like we're trying to hide something. I'm hiding nothing. I want you by my side for the rest of my life, and I don't want to wait. What would I be hiding? Lucy smiled, kissing him. She didn't care what anyone said. She'd marry him tomorrow if they had to run away to Gretna Green to do it. Asterisk. Lucy sat quietly while Abigail fixed her hair for her wedding. Her mother had been lecturing her for over an hour and showed no signs of slowing down. Why would anyone want to marry so quickly? What are you trying to hide, Lucy? When I was a girl, no one married without at least 3 months' notice unless she was pregnant. You realize all my friends are going to think you're carrying, and that's why you married in haste. It was bad enough when Charlotte married after 3 days of being engaged. You're not even waiting a full day. People will point at me and say things. Terrible things. Lucy looked at her hair and nodded. Yes, that's perfect, Abigail. Thank you. She stood and removed her dressing gown, still ignoring her mother. Too bad Charlotte hadn't announced a pregnancy that morning. It was the only thing that would get her mother off her back. Are you even listening to me? Yes, of course, Mama. I'm listening. She turned to look at her mother while Abigail dealt with the row of buttons that stretched from the waist of her dress all the way up her back. I'm just not changing my mind. Percy said it was fine with him. Percy just met him yesterday. He can't possibly know if he's the right man for you. I don't know what he was thinking, but clearly he needs to be more careful of the men he approves for you. This is unacceptable. Yes, Mama. Lucy slipped her feet into her slippers and looked into her mirror one last time. Abigail, would you let everyone know I'm ready? As her maid slipped from the room, Lucy sat on the end of her bed, carefully arranging her pale pink skirts around her. Do you want to have our talk now? Talk? I've been talking to you all morning, and you're not listening. The former Countess of Stenwick suddenly had a fearful look on her face. There's nothing else to say. She opened the door and all but ran from the room, causing Lucy to giggle hysterically. Charlotte had talked to her about the marriage bed the night before, so she knew what would take place. Lucy knew her mother would never be willing to speak of it, but it was a good way to get the older woman to be quiet for a while. Percy knocked on her door a moment later. Are you ready? Yes. Thank you for agreeing to the marriage so quickly. I know Mama isn't happy about it, but I do think I'm doing the right thing. Percy smiled. I think so as well. I wouldn't have agreed otherwise. He watched her as she got to her feet, a slight smile on his face. You look beautiful, Lucy. Oh, I know I'm not as pretty as Charlotte or Diana. Lucy had normal looks. Nothing special, but she didn't mind. She'd always thought of herself as someone who would catch a nice, normal husband and lead a boring life. She was apparently wrong. I disagree, and more importantly, so does Daniel. He offered her his arm, and they walked out of the room and down the stairs together. As she walked through the hall and into the large parlor where the wedding was taking place, she couldn't take her eyes off Daniel. He was dressed in formal black evening wear, his black shoes polished until they shone. When Percy placed her hand in Daniel's, she stared up at him, astounded that someone so incredibly handsome was marrying her. The ceremony went too quickly, and according to her mother later, the kiss went too long. They had a wedding lunch following the simple ceremony, and afterward Lucy and Daniel were off to his rented townhome in London. She sat beside him in the coach on the way back to the city, her head resting on his shoulder. I'm glad I get to finally be alone with you, he told her. As am I. Are you going to want to continue the constant round of parties in the evenings? Or will we be taking some time to ourselves? She didn't meet his eyes as she asked, because she couldn't stop thinking about what it meant to be alone together on their wedding night. She couldn't imagine why it was customary to hide the knowledge of how babies were made from young ladies until they were about to marry. Didn't it make sense to let them know so they had time to prepare themselves? He shook his head. I have to do some parties that I've already agreed to attend, but it's a small number. Maybe one per week instead of 5. Is that all right? That sounds wonderful. I'm rather tired of all the parties. I don't blame you. I don't understand why English parents insist on putting their daughters through that experience. Lucy looked at him with surprise. How do couples meet in Giselvakia? She'd never considered there was another way of doing things. Lucy, my love? You are now a princess of Giselvakia. Don't you think it's time you got the country's name right? I'm trying. Maybe if I write it 10 times 3 times per day, I'll remember. How do couples meet in Giselvakia? She asked again. I think that's the first time you've said the name right. I'm so proud. He kissed her nose with a laugh. To answer your question, most marriages in my country are arranged by the parents. It's not uncommon for a couple to meet on their wedding day. I'm not sure I'd like that. He shrugged. If you were raised to believe it was the way things should be, you'd be fine with it. I promise. He fidgeted a bit on the seat. I usually ride for long journeys. I abhor sitting in a closed carriage this way. He was happy to do it for her, though. Lucy smiled, her eyes dancing. Would it be possible for me to take your mind off of it? He raised an eyebrow, a smile forming at the corner of his lips. She'd never been quite so forward before. What exactly do you have in mind? I brought a deck of cards with me. I thought perhaps you could teach me to play whatever game is popular in your country. She carefully kept the laughter out of her voice as she said the words. His face fell. I could probably do that. Did you have something else in mind? She asked, carefully keeping her voice innocent. Oh, 1 or 2 things, he said, pulling her onto his lap. He cupped the back of her head in his hand and pulled her head down for his kiss. As soon as his lips touched hers, she pressed closer to him. She did love his kisses. His hands roamed over her body, one going around to cup her breast, while the other stroked her thigh through her gown. His hand dipped into her bodice, and his fingers caught her nipple, slowly rolling it. Lucy let out a gasp of surprise. Charlotte had told her he would touch her this way, but she'd never imagined it would happen in a coach. Not one to be outdone, she untied his carefully crafted cravat and put it onto the seat beside them. Then she unbuttoned the top 2 buttons of his shirt, her fingers going in to touch his smooth chest. By the time the coach came to a stop, they were both breathless and thoroughly disheveled. She moved off his lap when she realized they'd stopped and back onto the seat beside him. She quickly put her hands to her hair, trying to repair the damage his fingers had done, while he buttoned his shirt and retied his cravat. He did it with such speed, she wondered if he even had a valet. If so, she had yet to see the man. "Is my hair all right?" she asked, blushing profusely as she thought about how she'd allowed him to touch her while they drove. "It looks fine," he lied, not wanting her to be too distressed by it. He planned on taking her straight to his room anyway, so what difference did it make? There'd be plenty of time for her to meet his servants later. Only 2 were ones he cared about anyway. The others had been hired since he'd come to London. The door opened, and he climbed down, holding his hand up to help her. He nodded at the coachman before leading her inside. Lucy gazed at the townhouse and realized it was simply that. It wasn't an opulent palace, and for that she was thankful. She wasn't ready to be anything but a simple wife. A wife to a prince was a bit much at that moment. When he didn't stop in the foyer to introduce her, but instead kept her hand in his as he climbed the stairs, pulling her along behind him, she wondered if he knew their custom. "Daniel, it's customary for me to meet all your servants as soon as I come to your home after the wedding." He gave a quick nod, but continued along, her hand still tucked firmly in his. When he reached the top floor, he pulled her along down the hallway to a large room on the right. He opened the door and pulled her inside with him. "You can meet the servants later. For now? You need to be a wife." Lucy gasped as she understood his meaning. "But, it's daylight still." He laughed softly. "You are going to have to get past your English sensibilities, my dear. I don't care if it's daylight or not. I'm going to make love with you." He pulled her against him, his mouth descending to hers once again. "Did I misread you in the coach? Do you want me to stop?" Lucy shook her head. Even though she was embarrassed, she was very interested in finding out what it was all about. She loved him, and she wanted to be his wife in every sense of the word. "No, don't stop." Daniel turned her at the shoulders and began the painstaking task of unbuttoning the long row of tiny buttons that covered her from the top of her gown all the way down to her waist. He pressed a kiss to her shoulder as he worked. "You're a beautiful woman, my love." Lucy had no idea how to respond to that. If she said, "Thank you," would he think she agreed she was beautiful and think her vain? If she protested, would he get upset? Instead, she stood quietly while he unbuttoned her dress, every inch of her skin alive with discovery. Finally, he pushed the dress off her shoulders and turned her to him. Her corset covered most of her, but her breasts were spilling out over the top. She wanted to cover them with her hands as he stood and looked up and down her body. "You look even lovelier than I imagined." "You imagined me naked?" Lucy asked, not certain if she should be offended or pleased by his admission. "Many times." "Do you want to know what you were doing when I imagined you naked?" His tone of voice was wicked. Lucy shook her head. "No, I really don't think I do." "I'm going to tell you anyway," he whispered, his mouth pressed against her ear. "I imagined you leaning over me with your hair down, your hand moving over my stomach. I imagined you kissing me. I imagined you lying under me with your face filled with pleasure." Lucy blushed profusely. "I don't think you're supposed to talk to me that way," she said. He nipped her ear, his teeth scraping her lobe. "I don't exactly care what I'm supposed to do, sweetheart. We're married, and we won't hurt anyone else with our words." He reached behind her to untie her corset strings, his gaze on her body all the while. As her breasts were released, his eyes darkened with lust. She had never stood before a man in just her petticoats before, and had rarely stood before a woman that way. Only her maid and her sister had seen her thus, and they certainly had said nothing about her body. She wondered if she was pleasing to him. Daniel let out a low groan. You're going to kill me." Lucy looked at him with surprise. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I want you so much that I don't want to wait another second to be inside you." She started to tell him he shouldn't talk to her that way again, but she was cut off by the crush of his lips to hers. Her petticoat was pushed off her shoulders and onto the floor, and she stood naked before him except for her stockings and slippers. He pushed her back onto the bed, following her down, his mouth going to the side of her neck, nipping her softly. "Don't be afraid, my love. Anything you want, tell me. If I do something you don't like, you just have to let me know." "Is that possible?" Lucy asked. She bit her lip when she realized what she'd said. Had she given away too much of her feelings? "I sincerely hope not." He propped himself beside her on one elbow as his free hand stroked her bare skin. His thumb stroked her nipple to a hard peak. "You have the most beautiful breasts in all of Europe." She giggled softly. "Have you seen all the breasts in Europe that you can compare?" "Only my fair share," he said, his hand moving down to her thighs, pressing between them. He hadn't meant to talk about other women while he was in bed with her. Mainly paintings and statues. That was the truth. Lucy gasped as his fingers moved to her core, toying with the moist flesh there. She reached out and dragged his head down, kissing him as he'd taught her. As soon as their lips met, he took over the kiss, his tongue thrusting inside to mate with hers just as he slipped a finger inside her. He needed her to be ready for him. He groaned as her body clung to his finger, and he could only imagine how it would feel squeezing his shaft. He had to bring her to pleasure first, though. Lucy was shocked at how good his hand felt touching her where she'd never even dared to touch herself. Charlotte hadn't mentioned his fingers would go there. Only his man part. She wasn't about to complain, though. It felt too good. He added another finger to the first, and she sucked in a deep breath, not sure if it was from pleasure or pain. She didn't want just his fingers in her, she realized. She wanted more. "Aren't you a little overdressed?" she whispered against his lips. Daniel grinned as he drew back for a moment, staring into her eyes. "I think maybe I am." He removed his fingers from between her thighs and rolled to stand beside the bed. His fingers went to his cravat to untie it and throw it to the floor. Lucy got to her knees. "No, let me. I want to undress you like you undressed me." Her cheeks were flaming as she said the words, but she didn't let that stop her. She quickly unbuttoned all of his buttons and pushed his shirt off his shoulders. When it had fallen to the floor, she ran her hands over his bare chest, leaning forward to press a kiss to his shoulder. She'd never seen a man with no shirt on before, and she explored every inch of his chest. Her lips went to his nipple, and she licked it, wondering how he'd react. His groan told her that he enjoyed what she was doing to him, just as much as she enjoyed his touch. She felt as if she would go up in flames if they didn't hurry, but at the same time, she wanted to linger over his body. She moved her hands down the V of hair to the waistband of his slacks, not even sure how to unfasten them, but knowing they needed to come off. As soon as Daniel felt her hands on his pants, much too close to the part of him that was throbbing to touch her, he caught her hands in his, holding them against her sides. "You can undress me next time." "This time?" "I think I'll explode if I feel you touching me." Lucy nodded. "All right." She watched as he stripped his slacks down his legs and stepped out of them. She stared at his body as he stood naked before her. Surely Charlotte hadn't been right about what they'd do. That wasn't going to fit. "I'm not sure this is a good idea." He chuckled, his finger catching her under the chin and tilting her face up to his. "You, my lady, are going to enjoy this. Have we done anything you didn't like so far?" Lucy shook her head, keeping her eyes on his. If she saw it again, she might be more fearful. "I've liked it all." She wasn't certain if she should admit it, but he seemed to think they could say anything to one another. "You'll like this part too. I promise," he told her in a low whisper. He kissed her again, trying to keep the fear from taking hold. He couldn't wait much longer. She wrapped her arms around his neck, kissing him back. Her breasts pressed for the first time against his bare chest, and she shivered from the contact. He pulled back. "Are you cold?" "Anything but," she admitted, pulling him back down for more kisses. He climbed onto the bed with her, kneeling in front of her. They stayed that way for a moment, kissing and stroking each other's bodies. Finally, he pushed her back onto the bed, coming down over her. "I need you." She watched his face as he spread her legs, his hand stroking her core once, before he guided himself to her. She felt something hard press against her, and she gripped his shoulders nervously. Surely it was going to tear her in half if he tried to put that inside her. He kissed her softly, trying to calm her. He could see the fear in her eyes, and she was tensing up against him. "It's going to be all right. I promise." She nodded once, forcing her limbs to relax. This was her duty as a wife, whether she enjoyed it or not, and he was trying to make her enjoy it. She should be thankful she'd married such a good man. She watched his eyes as he slid into her, watched them as they turned darker with passion. What he was doing hurt, but it was worth it if it brought him so much pleasure. She could do this at least once a month if he needed her to. After a moment the pain stopped, but he was still inside her, holding himself perfectly still. She could see the sweat popping out on his forehead. "Is it over?" she asked. He kissed her softly, his hand stroking her face. "We've barely begun, love. But, it's in." He nodded, not sure how to explain. Deciding demonstration would be better, he pulled out and thrust deep once again. Lucy gasped as he moved, enjoying the feeling. "That felt good. Do it again." He chuckled at her enthusiasm, but was happy to comply. Afterwards, he pulled her close to him, pillowing her head on his shoulder and kissing her cheek. "Are you all right?" he asked. She propped her face up on her hand and looked down at him. "I am." "Are you?" He laughed aloud. "Never change. I want you to stay exactly as you are right this moment." Lucy smiled, dropping a kiss to his chest. "I'll do my best."